energy prices and what have you go down. And then we, over a period of 100 or 200 years of doing that, you eventually reach a point where resources are so cheap that people waste them with incredible profligacy and so on. And then out of that emerges massive ecological problems due to the excessive use of raw materials. So that then led to the question, well, what could you do to fix that? And so once again, to cut things quite short, what seemed to be the possibility was that you could run an economy in such a way that the price of energy was high and the price of labour was low. If you were in a cooperative and you simply said, we will set these prices in order to influence, let's say the cooperative was for covering the whole country. And so you'd say, okay, we will set the price of labour at whatever results in people being fully employed but not unemployed. So you don't put the price of labour up too high. You think, okay, we want to limit the ecological damage from resource use, so we'll make the price of energy and resources high. So you tax that money out, and then you can deliver people a full quality of life, full income, by delivering a dividend that comes from the resource tax. So the notion of a fee and dividend concept basically fell out of this kind of analysis, and that was back in about I think I did most of my initial intense work on it in about 1979. So fee and dividend seemed like a good idea at the time, and then I proceeded then to look at it in over a period of years, and you'll find in the paper that Jodie's got a copy of. This is the Australian New Zealand Ecological Economics Society paper. There's some additional ideas on how you can get greater benefits for the economy if you use a proportion of the fee income for innovation work and for other critical issues. So Jodie and I were discussing the possibility of providing at least some money for communities to engage in structural adjustments so they can move from depending on fossil fuel use, fossil fuel production or whatever, to change their economy to a different economic base to provide for people's livelihoods. So I think I might leave that part of it there. But anyway, the notion of fee and dividend has been around for some time. Then the next question, which I've been looking at more recently, probably since about 2005-6 onwards, is the notion of seeing the climate problem as an emergency problem, but also beginning to actually look at, in very serious way, at the application of emergency response as a way of handling something where you have to make really massive changes in a very short time. And so as part of that, I've done a lot of reading up on the economic management that applied during the Second World War, and ultimately I tracked back into the First World War, because it turned out that was quite interesting in throwing light on how the ideas developed in the Second World War. But what happened in the Second World War was that obviously people's lives were massively in danger. There was a very strong social commitment that, quote, something had to be done. So it was once war had broken out, it was extremely urgent project. But people mobilised their economies and redirected them incredibly rapidly. So, for example, within, I think, about a year, no, it might have even been less, of the declaration of war in the United States, that actually ceased automobile production. This is quite extraordinary. I mean, you think about the United States as the kind of the land of profligate consumerism, and the motor vehicle is a sort of a prime kind of example of that. And yet within less than 12 months, they'd actually banned the production of automobiles in order to free up resources in other parts of the economy. Now, so when people are worried that you can't solve the climate problem because it's too big and it'll quite take too long to resolve. There's the war effort shows that logistically it's you definitely, I mean, human beings are perfectly capable of making massive changes to the economy very rapidly. So that's been a very useful kind of historical analogy. The other thing which is interesting is the mechanisms that people use when they have to move fast. And in the Second World War, Tory Britain, like Britain under Churchill, and Australia under the Liberals, under Robert Menzies and so on, they moved almost immediately to a form of economic management which was quite different, totally different from the normal mode that they'd engaged in during peacetime. And that was purely pragmatic on their part. They'd learnt the lesson in the First World War that you can't run a war with the rapid rate of change and the enormous implications for economic restructuring using the same economic management methods you do in peacetime. So the notion of using legislation and kind of direct regulation for large scale things is something that emerges in that context where you have to move really fast. So those are kind of like bookend to like the fee and dividend concept, which I was looking at back in sort of 73 through to 79, etc. And then more recently, the emergency work. I think that we can find ways that these two modes of action can be brought together in a productive way in our present circumstances. So how are we going for time? Okay, I might... is there anything, Jodie, that you want me to cover that's come out of what I've immediately spoken about, or are you happy if I move on to the next part of the presentation?
Is everyone okay if we then go on to know more about investment legislation? Is that what you mean? And then questions afterwards?
Yeah, look, there was just one other aspect, which is the economic theory in relation to how the fee and dividend mechanism might actually work quite help. Yep. It might work quite well if it's in partnership with a more directly regulatory approach, and then I can go into the details of the No More Bad Investment Act. So just to give you the context, the No More Bad Investment Act simply says that if an act of this sort was passed, a bit like Costa Rica's now done, what you would do is say that certain types of activities which are known to be climate damaging and for which there are all known alternatives. So we know how to produce electricity through renewables with storage and with smart grids, etc. We know that we can produce motor vehicles that can use renewable energy through the electricity grid. There's a whole range of sectors of the economy that could actually transition very quickly, given that there are alternatives available. And so the No More Bad Investment Act would say something like, okay, these activities upon passage of this act, these activities would no longer be able to be invested in. So we wouldn't go further into the production of those types of activities. Now, if I step back from that at the moment and then say, okay, how does this relate to the fee and dividend concept? A fee and dividend system is a form of regulatory fee, tax, whatever. It's a regulatory system, which it works because it provides information into the market. It provides a sort of a disincentive because if you want to use lots of fossil fuels, then you pay an increased price for that. But the thing is that it's a signal, and the thing with signals is that people's response to the signal depends on what else is happening around them. So, for example, if there was no public transport, and you said what we're going to do is put a fee on the use of motor vehicles, then what would tend to happen is that people would just simply pay the fee and they'd keep on paying it because there was no alternative. So that signal wouldn't cause much switching in behaviour. And so it's actually very useful to have things that are operating in society which improve the responsiveness of society to the price signal. And so, the No More Bad Investment Act would actually make it likely that the fee structure of a fee and dividend system would actually have a much greater impact on what businesses do, because the two mechanisms together make it extremely clear what the direction of the economy is. And then anyway, so that's the basic idea. So that you can magnify the effectiveness of a fee structure by improving the responsiveness of society, and that can be done through both education and also technology investment, and also by other regulatory mechanisms that sort of reorientate society in the direction that the fee also is kind of moving in the direction of. So I might leave that one there and then move now just to the details of the No More Bad Investment Act. Is that okay with everybody? Okay. So where the idea of the No More Bad Investment Act came from was that a number of us were thinking about how you would get an emergency response going very fast. Now, the thing is that the environment and climate movement in Australia is used to single issue campaigning. Like, we've done that for decade after decade after decade, and so people find it. A lot of activists find it very difficult to imagine system-wide changes. Now, the pricing mechanisms are one example of a system-wide approach, which is unusual in the scheme of normal campaign approaches. So we were sort of thinking, okay, how could you make some early gains in the direction of a much more systematic approach in a context where people are not used to that? And so what we thought was the groups such as 350 and other related groups have been promoting for quite some years now the idea of divestment from fossil fuels or other climate damaging economic activities. And so that's now made the idea of not doing any more of that sort of stuff, it's made it well known in the community. And then the problem is, how do you ramp that up to make it 100% coverage? And you could try to get the whole society to all voluntarily divest, or you could work initially with the people who are most responsive personally. They're early movers and early responders. And then you could say, okay, well, there'll probably be a bunch of people in society who are a bit, slow to move, recalcitrant, whatever. And so eventually, if you want to get to 100%, it may actually work better if in the end, if you say, okay, at a certain point when there's enough public support and understanding of this approach, then you legislate to make it the behaviour of all of us. And so then the next question was, what would this legislation look like? And this is quite an interesting type of question to grapple with, because you've got exactly the same issue with the fee and dividend proposal, which is, okay, we've got a concept of fee and dividend, but what would it actually look like in Australia? What would the law say to establish it in this country, in our institutional arrangements, etc.? And so what we came up with when we explored how you might make a No More Bad Investment piece of legislation work was there were three parts to the legislation. One was an administrative entity to drive the process. And so I'll come back to that in a moment. The legal mechanisms were divided into two parts. One was an initial set of bans. So groups like Beyond Zero Emissions have analysed the economy and identified all sorts of areas where we have the technology already and we could move really fast. And so you could say, okay, let's now take those sectors, energy production, vehicle production, use of gas in domestic heating and arrangements, etc., those sorts of things for which there are really good alternatives. And you just legislate that they no longer, people can't buy those sorts of products anymore. They can't invest in new expansion of activity in those areas. Now, there's the rest of the economy. which is not necessarily quite ready to move. So what do you do with steel manufacturing? What do you do with plastics manufacturing? What do you do with aviation, seagoing ships? The list goes on. And so the idea was the second part of the legal controls would be that you would switch on the bans on investment at the point where the society, the government had worked out the appropriate alternatives in those industrial sectors. So then the question was, well, who did the work? Who does the work? Who activates that second process of turning on the bans when things are ready? And the idea was to create a climate restructuring authority, and that would then, in a sense, within government, do the kind of work that Beyond Zero Emissions, for example, has done as a private, as a community-based enterprise. So that intellectual work would be done inside government to make sure that appropriate alternatives are available. And then that restructuring authority would then recommend to the government to trigger the legal controls over the remaining sectors as they become ready to transition. The next question which came up was who should actually run this restructuring authority. Now, when I was working on the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act, we felt at the time, and it was, I think, a fair sort of summary of the political situation, that nature conservation, while it was a fairly widespread concern, it was probably not, let's say, maybe it wasn't a majority preoccupation, but it was, it was something that Australian culture was interested in broadly, but it was kind of like a specialist interest for a lot of people. And so what we did is, with the legislation, we sort of thought, well, let's try and give the power in the legislation to specialist agencies and to the Environment Minister, who can kind of be most tuned into that issue. Now, with something like restructuring an economy, it just literally affects everything. It affects everyone and everything. And so if you don't have the senior ministers, the Premier or the Treasurer or the Industry Minister or whatever, if you don't have them on side, they become the major blocker for the type of change that you need to make. So with the drafting of the No More Bad Investment legislation, which was pitched at the state and territory government level, we actually decided that it was going to be more or less meaningless unless you actually had the top, like the most powerful ministers as part of that restructuring authority. And so they would be members of the board of the Restructuring Authority organisation. So that was quite a different approach, and you find that more clearly it's most similar to the way that the economic management was undertaken during the Second and First World Wars, where it was absolutely the responsibility of the central government ministers to do that. It wasn't sort of pushed off to some sort of junior minister. Anyway, so they're the three parts. Immediate bans, a rolling process to work through the rest of the economy. So nothing's left out in the end. Agriculture would be brought in. Every sector that's complicated or difficult would eventually be covered. And then you have an engine of change in the case of the Climate Restructuring Authority to drive the process. In terms of the actual possibility of getting such legislation up and running, okay, it's pitched at the state governments and the territory governments. We've analysed which states and territories we think are the most likely to be early movers. And so the ACT administration is an obvious prime candidate. The South Australian government, or South Australian state, is a prime candidate because renewables are now such a significant part of the energy production system there, and the trend is clearly moving in that direction. And also, it doesn't appear that the momentum in that direction has been discernibly slowed down by the change of government quite recently. So anyway, so there are a number of states and territories where there's a possibility of getting this legislation up in the sort of near term, let's say sometime over the next 1, 2, 3, 4 years. and it may be able to be got up under either a left-leaning, as in Labor, Greens governments, such as you have in the ACT, or it might even be able to get up under a smallish L Liberal government, such as you've got in South Australia. So there's some very interesting possibilities, and it's probably a good thing to try and try it in both areas, so that we get used to, much the same way as CCL makes a very strong point of being sort of multi-partisan in terms of politics. The same thing would be incredibly important with the no more bad investment legislation. One final comment, and then I'll stop, is there might be an interesting synergy, just even in terms of organising, between the No More Bad Investments Act and the carbon fee and dividend legislation campaign, because the carbon fee and dividend is pitched at the national government, whereas the No More Bad Investments legislation is pitched at the state and territory governments. And so it may be possible to actually sort of, in a sense, combine that if there is a program of reaching out to politicians at both those levels of government. Anyway, that's probably enough for me in terms of